old were you when you met Dr. Alfred Kinsey?
It was probably in 1943 or so. I didn't know who he was. All I knew was that my dad was very excited about taking me there for an interview.
You ask, what would the American public say if they actually understood the background to what became the sexual revolution?
Do you ever remember your father molesting you with a stopwatch?
Yes.
This man was the singularly most important individual in the decriminalization of every single law that we had ever had that protected women and children.
In 2006, the law firm of Estee and Bomberger reported that the number of victims of childhood sexual abuse and molestation grows each year. This horrific crime is directly tied to the growth of pornography on the internet. They went on to say that research reveals that 77% of child molesters of boys and 87% of child molesters of girls admitted imitating the sexual behavior they had seen in pornography they had watched. Researchers argue that America's current problem with sexual predators is the fallout from the sexual revolution, a movement said to be inspired by the late Alfred Kinsey and his famous Kinsey reports, first published in 1948. In 1989, a report from the National Research Council published a statement that American society can be divided into two categories, the pre-Kinsey and post-Kinsey eras. How could one man's influence come to define our culture and produce what some consider the most harmful book in American history?
It would find its way into every aspect of our decision-making in our lives.
Dr. Judith Reisman is renowned for her expertise on the damaging influence of pornography. She has testified repeatedly before the U.S. Congress. Her research has been used by the FBI and by governments throughout the Western world. She is author of the book, Kinsey, Crimes and Consequences, in which she details the devastating impact of Alfred Kinsey in America.
How do you think it happened? It did not start today. It started back with Kinsey, and who then kicked off what has become today's horror show. The laws were changed based upon his fraudulent data, and he was directly involved in those changes. Kinsey went state by state. I have his testimony in California in 1949, telling a committee that was about to toughen the sex laws and toughen up about the laws to protect children because there had been a murder of 2 little girls. He goes to California to testify in 1949 that you should release everybody.
When the Kinsey report was first released, the famous ACLU lawyer Morris Ernst wrote that virtually every page of the Kinsey report touches on the legal code. He told the legal profession that no bar association, law school journal, or lawyers' committee can consider sex laws without the Kinsey study. After publishing his reports, Kinsey traveled the country, giving lectures at universities and testifying before lawmakers. He was received as the leading scientific expert in the world on human sexuality. In particular, he discussed laws concerning sex offenders and the education of children.
Of children, he said 100% are orgasmic from birth. Therefore, children can benefit from sex with adults and even incest, which is illegal, so we need to lower the age of consent. Children need early explicit school sex education since they're sexual from birth, which was illegal at the time. Now it's everywhere. They need masturbation and hetero and homosexual acts to be taught to them, which was illegal, and now it's being taught. And about parole, Kinsey said that sex offenders rarely repeat sex crimes. Therefore, all sex offenders should be paroled. 1950, Rockefeller funded the American Law Institute Model Penal Code. 1952, a Harvard Law Review called for a code to change our sex laws in accordance with what Kinsey had objectively found. And then in 1955, the code was created and sent out to all legislators in the country via these important people, judge, lawyers, sociologists, lawyers, and so forth. And from there, that went, the ALI model, the sex offenses section, sent to states all over the country, adopted all or in part beginning in 1956 here and moving on to Illinois, to Minnesota and so forth, and all other states of the Union.
In the 1950s, a congressional committee was formed under Congressman B. Carroll Reese to investigate the influence of the large tax-exempt foundations, including Rockefeller.
There was a huge concern at the time, in the 1950s, that the foundations were now being run by people with a strikingly strident, a libertarian or liberal agenda, which resisted and resented the Judeo-Christian way of life.
Through the 1930s and 40s, Alfred Kinsey conducted thousands of interviews with both men and women, taking, as he called it, their sexual histories. Upon interviewing thousands of volunteer subjects, Kinsey not only recorded data, but drew certain conclusions about the sexual behavior of men, women, and children. Among Kinsey's more controversial claims is the idea that 10% of American men were fully homosexual for at least 3 years of their life, while 37% of American men had engaged in homosexual contact to the point of orgasm at least once in their lives. Later studies would place those numbers much lower, with only 1% of men in the U.S. claiming to be homosexual, while only 2 to 3% admitted to some kind of homosexual activity in their lifetime. Nevertheless, Kinsey's data was seized upon by men like Harry Hay, who read the Kinsey reports, left his wife and children, and went on to found the gay rights revolution that began in the 1960s. To this day, the gay rights movement is largely based on Kinsey's data. According to his fellow researchers, the reason for this dramatic difference is because Kinsey manipulated the data, including men from America's prisons, as part of the regular male population.
He wrote that he found 1,300 to 1,400 sex offenders that he used as his normal male population. What?
In addition to the convicted sex offenders, Kinsey included regular prisoners who were serving time for other offenses, along with 199 sexual psychopaths, all mixed together as part of the regular male population and presented to the American people as the average American male. In this interview for the documentary titled 1 in 10, listen as Paul Gephardt, who was one of Kinsey's co-authors and a member of his original team, admits to the high percentage of prisoners and their impact on Kinsey's data.
With these poorer, lower educational level samples. And when I say poorer, they had, for example, 55% were prison. We didn't have enough non-prison people to do much of a comparison, but he didn't do a comparison. He simply took the prison people he got and used them with that less than college educated sample.
With America's prison population presented as the average male, is it any wonder that laws would be changed to accommodate sexual predators while failing to protect women and children? To create high levels of homosexual activity, Kinsey also went into Chicago's underground, into gay bars and homosexual bathhouses, and incorporated the radically gay population into his regular male data.
They use this picture all the time to try and show the American public that they were interviewing average American women, all right? Except that this was their secretary, okay? This is a secretary at the Kinsey Institute, and they would always label her as though she was just some average American woman.
In fact, prostitutes were a subculture that Kinsey specifically sought out, mixing them in with the regular female population. Kinsey went on to report that an incredible 87% of unmarried women were having abortions, while 25% of married wives were also aborting. It was these high percentages, shocking even by today's standards, that would help to legalize abortion in the years that would follow. For decades, Dr. Judith Reisman has argued against what is often referred to as Kinsey's junk science because of its dramatic and devastating impact on American law and society.
Corrections starts to enact all of this into corrections decisions. In the legal profession and law schools, now Kinsey would be taught as part of the legal structure via the American Law Institute Model Penal Code. That ferrets out into the private and public education, becomes our sex education, is in our American Law Review journals. It's found in parole through corrections, state and local, and criminal, civil, family, and juvenile justice. And expert witnesses then from the sex world begin to inform this whole structure.
As Reese Committee lawyer Renee Wormser states in his book, the much-publicized Kinsey studies base an advocacy of criminal and social reform on the very unscientific material which Dr. Kinsey had collected. Wormser went on to cite psychiatric historian Albert Deutsch, who said of the Kinsey reports that so startling are its revelations, so contrary to what civilized man has been taught, that they would be unbelievable but for the impressive weight of the scientific agencies backing the survey. Wormser comments saying, "Note how impressive is the word scientific and how false." The Reese Committee wrote that it seems to this committee that there is a strong tendency on the part of many of the social scientists whose research is favored by the major foundations toward the concept that there are no absolutes, that everything, including basic moral law, is subject to change, however fundamental it may have been deemed to be under our Judeo-Christian moral system. The puerile doctrine that change is always necessary has led many of these scientists to believe that there are no longer any inalienable rights. They deem themselves justified, with the support of foundation grants, to label their prejudices as truth and to experiment with society. By far, the most disturbing evidence against the Kinsey reports is the information pertaining to the sexual behavior of children. The child sexual data was more fully exposed by Dr. Judith Reisman in the 1980s, who brought the even more disturbing allegation that Kinsey had trained multiple pedophiles to molest children while using stopwatches to record so-called scientific data. Needless to say, the Kinsey Institute today denies Dr. Reisman's allegations. They maintain that all of the child sexual data came from one man, who just happened to keep detailed scientific records of his encounters with children. This lone pedophile theory was developed by Dr. John Bancroft, who became the director of the Kinsey Institute in 1995. Bancroft not only argued that the data came from just one man, but that Kinsey supposedly only got hold of the information years after this pedophile was finished raping kids. This is contrary to Kinsey's own report, in which he admitted to at least 9 pedophiles from whom he obtained information. But in this 1995 interview on Canadian television, Dr. Bancroft says that Kinsey only referred to 3 or 4 pedophiles, and then insists that in reality it was only 1. Listen now as this Canadian journalist seems to get uncomfortable during the interview.
Did he make it clear in the report that the conclusions on the sexual capacity of 317 children were based solely on the evidence of one sexual criminal?
No, he suggested that it may have been from 3 or 4. I don't think that is a particularly important difference. Kinsey...
but isn't that conspicuously misleading?
I think he was misleading. I think that he
I'm sorry, you don't think he was misleading? Forgive me?
Yes, I think he was misleading, but I don't think it was a misleading of any consequence. He was concerned about his maintaining confidentiality. Throughout his volumes, he tended to avoid drawing attention to any particular individuals.
It's not significant that the conclusions of a study on the sexual responses of children come solely from a man who really has who's a deviant? Doesn't he have a skewed perception of child sexuality?
Well, that was just one type of evidence.
Next, the journalist asks why it took so long to discover that the information came from a single pedophile rather than multiple pedophiles, as Kinsey had reported. Bancroft's only answer is to say that he worked it out once he became the Kinsey Institute director.
Why did it take so long to set the record straight?
When I got to the Kinsey Institute and these accusations were continuing, some people were expressing, some otherwise reasonable people were beginning to worry about these accusations and saying, well, now, how is it that if he's got information from 3 or 4 men, he can standardize it in such a way that it goes into a table unless somehow or other he's trained these men to make these observations. People were beginning to express that concern, therefore I decided to look more closely at the source of information, and that's when I realized that actually, as far as those tables were concerned, the information all came from this one man who had been collecting this information in an extraordinarily methodical way throughout his life since about 1917.
And you knew of this for how long? That it was that Kinsey was misleading in this?
I worked out that there was one man involved soon after I came to the Kinsey Institute, and shortly after that we issued a press statement from Indiana University making this point clear.
So, I'm sorry.
That was at the beginning of September.
What the criticism is also, and it's significant, is that Alfred Kinsey was guilty of academic dishonesty, and if the Institute if the Institute would have been more forthright, the people from the political and religious right wouldn't have the kind of ammunition that they now have to try to not only discredit Kinsey, but the teaching of sex education in schools.
There is no reason to say that Kinsey has been dishonest.
Is this the devastating fruit of Kinsey's sexual revolution? Furthermore, should Americans trust information about child sexuality from child molesters who were raping kids? As Dr. Bancroft has admitted, Kinsey's pedophile data directly impacts sex education in America.
These specific findings about these children are totally irrelevant to modern sex education.
But the most disturbing evidence comes from Kinsey's so-called scientific tables, wherein he describes the sexual responses of young children. In Kinsey's tables 31 through 34, he documented the timed orgasms of children as young as 2 months old, recording their responses down to the 10th of a second. The findings are so extreme that one child, a 4-year-old, is said to have had 26 orgasms within a 24-hour period. For Dr. Reisman, the obvious question was, where did Kinsey get such information?
And I looked at those charts and graphs. I can't tell you how long it took me to try to process what I was seeing. This is the torture of children.
At the base of Table 31, Kinsey tells us that the data is based on actual observation of 317 males. Then on page 177 of the male volume, Kinsey writes, orgasm is in our records for a female babe of 4 months. But how would anyone recognize such a response in a young child? Kinsey wrote that among pre-adolescent boys and among younger females, orgasm is not so readily recognized.
And so I thought, what did this man, this Kinsey, call an orgasm? Right. I mean, it's an obvious question, isn't it? I mean, first of all, this was not possible, but second of all, what did he call? Well, I saw he documented it on page 160 and 161. in Kinsey's book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. He described specifically what he called an orgasm amongst these children.
Kinsey defined orgasm for pre-adolescent children with the following description: a gradual and sometimes prolonged build-up to orgasm, which involves still more violent convulsions of the whole body, heavy breathing, groaning, sobbing, or more violent cries, sometimes with an abundance of tears, especially among younger children.
And he said that those were all examples for him, of orgasm. At that point, reading that, I said, the only person who could write that would be, number one, a pedophile or a pederast, because these were boys. It was homosexual abuse of boys. And a sadomasochist. That is, the only human being in the world who could call an orgasm something that involved people throwing up, I mean, having convulsions, fainting, screaming, crying. The only person who could do that is someone who experienced that themselves. And that had to be a sadomasochist.
And you know what Gebhardt said to me? You know what Dr. Gebhardt said? He wrote me a letter, which I wish you had up there too, in which he said oral and manual techniques were used on those children.
The letter that Dr. Reisman refers to was written by Paul Gebhardt on March 11, 1981, in which he attempted to explain where the child sexual data came from. In this letter, he admits that multiple pedophiles were used in collecting information for the Kinsey reports. Gebhardt writes, "Since sexual experimentation with human infants and children is illegal, we have had to depend upon other sources. Some of these were parents. A few were nursery school owners or teachers. Others were homosexual males interested in older but still prepubertal children. One was a man who had numerous sexual contacts with male and female infants and children, and being of a scientific bent, kept detailed records of each encounter." Gebhardt went on to say that some of these sources have added to their written or verbal reports photographs, and in a few instances, cinema. Gephardt's letter clearly refutes the lone pedophile theory of Dr. John Bancroft, but fits in perfectly with what Kinsey documented in Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. Gephardt's mention that photographs and cinema were sent to Kinsey also explains the discovery made by former Kinsey Institute director June Reinisch in 1984.
This was Newsweek in '84 when June Reinisch said, you know, that the Institute encourages visitors and so forth. And she says, what's her name, Reinisch says, that she found a collection of child pornography so distasteful to Reinisch personally, she couldn't bear to look at it.
There was also a pedophile organization in this country. They cooperated with us, and some of them who were not, of course, not incarcerated, they came and they gave us information.
Dr. Reisman believes the pedophile organization mentioned by Gebhardt may have been the nucleus for what would become NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association. To this day, NAMBLA looks to Alfred Kinsey as their inspiration, saying that gay liberationists in general, and boy lovers in particular, should know Kinsey's work and hold it dear. Implicit in Kinsey is the struggle we fight today. Many of the children abused by Kinsey's pedophiles probably had no idea that they were part of a government-sponsored study. But when the Family Research Council released its documentary, The Children of Table 34, the haunting image of a stopwatch sparked the memory of a woman who calls herself Esther White.
My grandfather molested me when I was around 4, and he never did again. But he went to Indiana University to get his teaching certificate. And he took biology while he was there. And so I'm assuming that he probably met Kinsey there because the whole university was involved in his research.
As a child, Esther says she was taken by her father and grandfather to meet with Alfred Kinsey and to be interviewed by him.
I didn't really I didn't connect at all until I read Judith Reisman's writings, especially when it came to the video that she did where they showed a stopwatch. And that was the key. I realized, yes, that was what was going on.
Now in her 70s, her desire is to remain as anonymous as possible, out of consideration for her family. Esther White is her assumed name.
How old were you when you met Dr. Alfred Kinsey?
It was probably in 1943 or so, 43 or 44. I was born in 34.
Esther's own father had been molesting her for years and sending information to the Kinsey Institute. When Kinsey's book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, was released, her father showed her a copy and boasted that he had helped to write it. At the time, she did not know what he meant.
Do you ever remember your father molesting you with a stopwatch?
Yes.
And then would he record information?
There were papers on the dresser, and I saw one of the papers one day, and it had a lot of questions on it. And there were little boxes to check those things off when those things were done. And it was talking about orgasm. I didn't know what that word meant, but at the time. And when I asked him what that word meant, when I saw it on the paper, he grabbed the paper, put it in a brown envelope, and he said that he was late in sending this in.
It's got nothing to do with science. It's always been political. It's always been people's own sexual perversions that have driven them. And now that drives those sexual perversions into the schoolroom in the form of sex education curricula.
Some of the leading pedophile supporters include the late Dr. John Money of Johns Hopkins University, Dr. John DiCecco, Professor Gilbert Hurt, and Dr. Hubert Kennedy, all out of San Francisco University. Perhaps the most influential was the late Dr. Vern Bulla from the Center for Sex Research at California State University, Northridge. Each of these men have either been editors for or have appeared in the Netherlands publication, Paideia, the Journal of Pedophilia, a pseudo-academic journal specifically dedicated to normalizing and ultimately legalizing child molestation in society. Also appearing in Paideia was Dr. Ralph Underwager, who was often called as an expert witness in court cases involving child abuse. In his 1991 interview with Paideia, Underwager stated that pedophiles can boldly and courageously affirm what they choose. They can say that what they want is to find the best way to love, an acceptable expression of God's will for love and unity.
We have turned our back on understanding that this is a significant, profound problem in the church. And I think that there needs to be an awareness and education, and I think that pastors need to address it from the pulpit.
Jeff Reinke is the marriage and family pastor of North Coast Calvary Chapel in Carlsbad, California.
I am grieved at the lack of moral outrage that there is lacking today in our culture, and particularly in the church, in the whole area of sexual perversion.
Manipulation of truth and political pressure have continued to protect the influence of Alfred Kinsey and his followers for more than half a century. In the 1980s, the Reagan administration developed a commission to investigate the influence of pornography. The Department of Justice brought in Dr. Judith Reisman, who initially wanted to investigate Kinsey along with the images in Playboy, Penthouse, and Hustler. But just as the Reis Committee was opposed in the 1950s, So Dr. Reisman was shot down in the 1980s. She conducted her research at American University, but once she began, the university vehemently opposed any investigation into Kinsey, and she was forced to drop it. The president of American University at the time was Dr. Richard Berenson, who was later exposed in a sex scandal involving a series of obscene phone calls in which Berenson claimed he had a 4-year-old girl that he kept as a sex slave down in his basement. The calls were eventually traced to his office at American University. Berenson was exposed as a pedophile.
And I spoke with a lawyer later, and it turned out, of course, he had pornography in his drawers. They cleaned out the office, got rid of the pornography, though they found out later, the lawyer did, that it had been there. And he quickly fled, ran to Johns Hopkins University, and entered there and stayed there for, I think it was 3 weeks, and got a clean bill of health from Johns Hopkins, saying that...
You mean like psychiatric treatment?
Yes. Yes, suddenly he was okay.
But political opposition came not only from American University, but also in Washington, D.C., over the analysis of Playboy, Penthouse, and Hustler. As a result, Dr. Reisman was forced to publish her report independently. The FBI and 7-Eleven took notice, as we mentioned earlier, and that's when the soft porn giants fought back. In her book, The Powerhouse, journalist Susan B. Trento documents how Playboy and Penthouse magazines hired a Washington-based PR firm named Gray & Company to create a media blitz that would discredit Dr. Reisman and the entire Reagan Commission on pornography. Because of the controversy, it would be a decade later before Dr. Reisman's research would be officially embraced by the Department of Justice. In a letter written by past administrator Robert Sweet, he says, while the massive affluent sex industry has employed nearly every technique in their arsenal short of violence to stop Dr. Reisman's work, they have not shown her findings to be incorrect or methodologically flawed in even the smallest detail. Dr. Reisman has for years argued against the harmful impact of the sex industry on America's children. Many of the PhDs who teach in our universities have not only been associated with the Journal of Pedophilia, but have also served as the board members for pornographic magazines like Penthouse Forum. These are the people who have designed the programs for sex education in America. Because Kinsey chose to define the pain and suffering of abused children as orgasm, he then argued that children were sexual from birth and should be taught about having sex as soon as possible. While most who promote the programs probably don't know it, this thinking is what lies behind the idea of teaching sex education to kindergartners.
I remember him using this in his campaign against me, saying Barack Obama supports teaching sex education to kindergartners. And, you know, which I didn't know what to tell him. But it's the right thing to do. To provide age-appropriate sex education, science-based sex education, science-based sex education in the schools.